Everybody gets frustrated and starts gluing their hand to the table. Get a jar of alcohol, ordinary isopropyl alcohol. Serves two purposes. Any that ooze out the edge, you can get up. It'll just save even more weight. And this lets you put a lot of pressure and get the glue to work its way right down into the wood. Now, some has already oozed out on a table. I like to work fast because I'm going to have to trim off the extra doubler here. And while this is drying, I'll make up the doubler for the back. I want to have that edge perfect. And I can see I've already got the alignment that I want on here. Now I can just press down. And this gets rid of every possible fingerprint. When you're done with this, there's no sanding at all. You're done. The alcohol and the rag really makes this a reasonable, well, almost reasonable. Anyway, I have a ruler. Nice straight edge to make sure I've not lost that edge. And now what I'll do is I'll get myself a 1-inch top block and some weights, some cans, and put this under pressure for an hour or so. And while this is drying up, what I can do, again, I'll make up those two tail doublers and make the joints on the tail. But I can have this one drying anyway. And what I can do is, I don't know why I keep checking this, it looks pretty good. Put this under some weights, some gallon cans, and give it an hour or so to dry. Best for last, this is my real light piece of 1/8 inch wood. I want to get an edge and an edge. Notice I haven't cut the fuselage out yet. I just want to get a straight butt joint. And of course that'll be, this is the real light piece of wood. I want this as far back into the plane as possible. And I'm going to make a 1/64 inch doubler to go around this. Just get a rough idea how big this has to be. See, the deal is I'm not cutting this out right now. This can just be this large. I'll leave it a little oversized. What I want to do is work out a real nice joint. Then I can just trim this off. Since this is the lightest piece of wood, it's the furthest back in the plane. Using this ruler as a little guide so I can see how I'm going to dress that joint off. Okay, I don't need the plans now. I can see it's hard up here. I'm just going to take just a little bit of material off. What you do is look for the spot that's hard, dress some of the material off of that side. Now to make a real nice joint, what I'm going to do is lay this over a piece of Teflon. If you don't have Teflon, obviously wax paper is a good choice, and just CA it. But while I'm dressing this off, I'm leaving the dust. Don't take the dust away. When you want to do a good butt joint, leave the dust. We're hard right in the middle. Leave the dust. That's what makes for a good joint. I'm going to get the Teflon. First is a real clean surface because we're going to be pressing down. I don't want to inch up the wood any more than I have to. Use the old scraper. I want to lay out, if I didn't have Teflon, again wax paper would be okay. Lay out my straight edge. Lay out my side which has the dust left on. Now let's see which way this likes to sit the best. Now since we're going to put a 64th plywood doubler over that, I'll just let this kick normally. Let the dust do the kicking. Now we want to get the doubler on here as soon as possible. I need to cut that out of 64th plywood. And then when I'm all done, that means all the doublers will be in place. Then I can do the final outline of the fuselage. Outlining and center lining and all that stuff. But notice that I have not trimmed anything until all the joints are totally finished. It makes for a real nice, neat joint. And a nice straight edge too. When I installed those 64th doublers, obviously what I wanted to do is line up the fuselage, leading edge of the wing. Make sure in other words, what I'm striving for is a complete mirror image from one end to the other, so both sides are exactly the same. Alright, we're ready to trim the fuselage sides. Notice I didn't trim any of the wood yet. But now this is going to be I'll get a cutting pad out. This will be relatively easy to make a complete mirror image from my doubler pattern, my mirror image pattern that I have off the plans. And we should wind up with two phone calls exactly the same. Let me get the phone. Obviously, get out the cutting pad, brand new blades. I can take all this out, all these angles. But that is one nice, that's a real efficient way to make a fuselage side. If you can make a fuselage side doing that method, no matter what ship it's for, that's the best way I know of. Obviously we want to have all nice neat cuts, straight edge cuts, whatever. Up here I can actually just use the doubler, using a cutting pad, an XL cutting pad. Now, getting the wing cut out, of course, the most significant thing is to get the two wing cutouts lined up so when you put the fuselage together you don't have one in front of the other or one sideways or getting that alignment. So it's real critical, and I really like to use the doubler as my guide, but the biggest single thing is I'm going to then go down to the belt sander and pin these two together again, or tack glue them. That's another easy way to do it, and make sure these are exact copies when they're together. There's no variation in them at all. Now in this case we're just using the plywood for the guide. And if you've ever tried to make a side or a thing where you have the doubler and a fuse side and they both have a wing cut out in them and you try to line them up, then you probably know I'm not kidding. You just a lot of work there for nothing. If you can do it this way, wow, does this save you work. Back, this plywood, of course the grain is going straight up and down because I'm trying to avoid twisting. It'll also give me a real good place to mount the tail wheel if I want to do that back there. Because we're going to have a removable tail, I need a place to attach that plywood. There's going to be a plywood tongue in here. Okay, we're about ready to true these up. Notice at every step we attach them together and do a truing operation. That is the most significant thing to remember. As soon as you finish the first one, you can lay it out on the second one and use it for your reference so that every time you do an operation, you don't build in a variation. This is all pinned together now and I can true up all the edges. Now I want to make sure when I look through the wing hooks, the cowl edges, and the tail seat that they're all exactly the same and there's no variation here, because once you start with a variation in a fuselage, it is impossible to make a good fuselage. And this is the best way I know, is take care of all these variations right at this stage before we make the crutch. Okay, we end the session with a nice set of fuselage sides. Tomorrow we'll pick up some more of the fuselage parts. Just nice to see a day's work and you have some part to show for it anyway. Now what's nice is every morning coming out here to basically look at the molds, see how they're coming out. This is our latest, one of our latest molds. And of course we're going to make a separate, totally separate thing. I just like to show the little progress report. We also got this guy, the 6-cavity guy, and we'll be pulling him apart later today. Well, we're going to lay these up. Now the idea is while these are being laid up, I'm going to need to cut out an additional set of fuselage sides for what will be the plug for the carbon mold. So obviously what I'm going to have to do is make up a duplicate set of this with all balsa wood and not plywood, and I'll do that off camera because it'll just be redundant, because the one that's going to be a plug, I'm not going to need to worry about anything other than that it just becomes a perfect replica size-wise of the original one. I'll do that part off camera. Just one little tip, and it's a good idea whenever you're installing, since we're doing this part of it, installing doublers. For my plug I don't need to use plywood, I'm just using regular balsa, but always to let it dry inside a compressed area, like I took a 1-inch top block, an old top block, and a gallon can that's full. That makes a good little vise to squash the doubler down. Okay, so now we have mirror images from the original pattern, the 2 actual fuselage sides with plywood doublers, and the 2 fuselage sides with balsa doublers that we're going to use to make the plug. The rule is that I made up with those little the holes for the center lines, and what I want to do here is just etch on as carefully as possible on all of the fuselage sides. I want to put a center line. Now sometimes what's a pain is it's hard to find a pen that, in this case I've got the, here, see what just happened? I wanted to show that. The pen bites into the wood, so what's good to do is maybe just go back over it a few times. Now you can find these, see, these are Pilot Precise. They're real pointy, but the problem is they bite into the woods. And I want to leave enough of an impression in that wood, even after I dope over it. I want to be able to go back and reference that line. Just a couple of tips, since we've over the years had hundreds and hundreds of sets of motor mounts. If you store motor mounts, don't store them in a dry attic. Store them where the humidity is high. One time I took a whole box like this that had over 100 sets of mounts in it, put it up in a dry attic, the heat wave came, and the wood all turned to a pretzel. Anyway, I picked out 2, they look relatively straight anyway. Anyway, you really want to do with this set. And John Gajewski is the one that cuts these. So we'll start with 2 exactly identical set of mounts. Now I'm ready to start making up the crutch. I have a set of 3/8 mounts that I'm going to use in the plug side of this. And I have a set of 3/8 same mounts, but they're channeled out with a saw blade on a circular saw. We've done this on the last 3 planes that we've built, so I have no reason to think this is not going to work, except for the fact President Nixon's calling me. Nixon confirms via phone that he will be building a Miss Ashley. Now what was real significant here, and I wanted to show, is that all the mounts are the same thickness, because I don't want one fuselage to be wider, the plug to be wider than the fuselage. I'm trying every step of the way to monitor that one isn't going to be any fatter than the other. But anyway, I'm going to use the hollow mounts. First thing I have to do is make up a set of aluminum pads for the jet, and we already have a template for that. It's relatively easy to do. Nice box, and see how I met each motor that I have, and it's a good idea to do in your own collection, is make up a template for each one. And obviously there's one in here for the jet. Oh, here it is in my hand. Maybe that's why I can never find anything. And I have one for Mokies and one for whatever. But always a good idea to have one for every motor that you're going to do. Okay, a couple of thoughts. This is not just stop sign aluminum or, melt down a tin can aluminum. This is 6061 T6. It's rock hard aluminum and it's anodized, so it has a surface that's hard as glass, prone not to corrode, because this is going to be the spot that the motor rests on and vibrates onto for the whole life of the aeroplane. So I have a pattern. I just need to make up a couple of sets of these right in the drill press. Now let's see, do we want red ones or blue ones? Hard to make these cosmetic decisions. Anyway, I need to make 2 sets up. I wanted to try, I ran the first set off just to try this. I want to try using shoulder bolts. These are 440 shoulder bolts, since the jet really vibrates so little, it's not a problem. I'm sure we're not going to have a problem with 440s, but I want to use shoulder bolts. One reason is I can drill the holes real precision here, and it'll mean a lot smaller of a hole in amount. I hope I'm going to buy some strength by doing it this way. So now that I have one, of course I want to check one. I need to deburr it. But the idea is that that's a nice tight fit there, and since I already have the holes in the motor for 632, I'll have my offset built right in right from the get-go, since I don't plan on changing those holes in the motor, and then all the motors, of course, in turn fit the planes that we've already made for the jet. You can use when drilling these from a pattern. You can either clamp this in a vise or whatever, or what I prefer to do is drill one hole first, and since this is a precision hole, the shoulder is 111, the drill is 113, it's a nice tight fit. Now with that hole, with that in there, I can line these and drill the second hole. Always have one bolt in place when you drill the second one. Makes for a lot more accurate hole drilling setup. And I got to make 2 sets of these. The drill, and I want to countersink these. I just want to get the burrs off before we actually go to install them. Always having a little edge broken like that is always a good idea. Now I need to figure about 1/8 of an inch for a prop for a plywood nose ring. Center that. This gives me a little mark now. And I can screw these down right down to the mounts with the 2 little number 2 wood screws. It's always easy to drill 2 little pilot holes with the smallest drill you have just to get the wood screws started. Make sure this lines up perfectly with the edge of the mount. These are just ordinary number 2 wood screws. Now I usually try to make the pilot hole as small as possible, which means getting the screws in the first time is a nuisance, but I just feel like I don't want to have any hole in that wood that I don't need. Then the most important thing here is make sure both sides nice and parallel, they're not sticking out. In this case we're going to make the hollow part, the fuselage plywood doubler will go on this side, but I've made them both ways, and you can always make, if you have a router especially, you can make balsa wood that the center wood has that little notch in there too. That's another way to do it, but we've made enough of them this way. We know this is usually a good system. Only because I'm trying to make a plug, I want to make sure these are as similar as possible, so I'm going to make the extra setup, and that's going to be about it for today, because sooner or later what's going to happen here, Karen is going to pull a plug on this whole operation, and it's going to be pizza time. Anyway, I want to get these, in fact I'll try to finish these. So I have the hollow set and a solid set, and that'll be the end of today's little operation. Always good to end on a positive note. See you tomorrow. Well, this is what I love, getting up in the morning, getting all my molds. I just wanted to show this once or twice on tape, because I know there's people that like to make their own shape wheel pants. It's really not that big of a deal. It's all been documented on video, and these little puppies and our multi-cavity mold, these release, and these have this little recess that the landing gear hooks in. So these should be even nicer. Anyway, Karen has just told me this morning that basically this weekend we're going to put up our Christmas decorations, our train around the tree. It's Christmas time and Windy Vision goes into Christmas mode, so we're going to take a little break from the molding things here. I want to finish up the crutches if I can today. This should be, I don't know, Christmas time just gets to be very special around this house. Up for the pull tomorrow morning and join the other parts. Like during this last couple of weeks, we've added another nice product to the things that we can manufacture right in-house. But now we want to get back to working on that crutch. I get a drill that's an exact, maybe a thousandth or two bigger than the shoulder, because I want these. The idea of these shoulder bolts is that they're going to be nice and tight in the holes. They're not going to rock back and forth and have a tendency to get loose. I also set up a drill the exact size of, you can see what I've done, the exact size of the blind nuts, the amount that the blind nut goes in there, so that when I drill these holes, this is going to relieve just that amount. Just exactly that amount. Now I want to reverse drill these for the blind nut side. I don't want to drill the size of the blind nut through the whole mount. The idea here is to keep the holes in the mounts as small as possible. That little tape just acts as a gauge, a stop gauge. You can see we've got just exactly the right amount. I don't want to make, remember the key thing here is I don't want to have the holes in the mounts any bigger than I have to. And the whole idea of this is that the blind nuts are now about 1/1000th undersize. Now before we put the screws in, we're going to put a little chain lube on the bolts. Just one little drop of chain lube on the bolt ends themselves, because otherwise before we put CA on that, we'll have a tendency to glue them right into the threads. This is a great little trick. Just let this soak for a few minutes. Run this through the threads on all the blind nuts. Now how many times I've made a crutch, and boy, if the blind nuts get glue in the threads, this eliminates the problem 100%. Before we tighten that up, now that should have just a slight bit of grease. Now I can CA the bolts in place. I think that's a good tip is, you notice I haven't CA'd the bolts in yet. Two reasons. I want the actual tension of the motor itself to pull the nuts into complete square, even though I've tapped them in place. Nothing worse than having one of these blind nuts at a little bit of an angle, and every time you go to start it, it won't catch, it won't catch. Now see, I still have some grease on these bolts, so there's no chance I'm going to leave the bolts in place with the grease on it while I put the CA, so that it'll install these permanently then. Now one thing I just thought of, you know, what's happening is this project is evolving. What it started out to be and what it is now, it's evolved into something even more complex. And I was thinking what I'll do maybe is somewhere down the road, make an extra crutch for one of the carbon fuselages with carbon mounts. I can mold the mounts and make a pretty exotic little mounting system. Because if we're going to be able to just replicate the fuselage, I don't even have to paint it to see if that'll work. Anyway, it's evolving into a pretty interesting modeling project. One of the things I'm always real careful of when I make a crutch is make sure I can see light down through. If that case is pressed right up against the aluminum, it's hard to put any motor offset in. Let's see, I have just enough room to do that. Now if you're in doubt, another way to do this is lay 3 or 4 pieces of masking tape along the edge of the mounts when you line up the bolts. Because you want to be able to take this in essence and make a fine tuning on motor offset if you decide that's one of the trim features you're going to want. Anyway, I've never found a better way to make a crutch than this. This is the premier way that I've found to make it, and it's no matter what model you make, this is a great way to do it. I want to measure roughly how far back because the last little piece I'll put in with cross grain ball, so we're going to roughly have it up to there. Now I'm looking through my 1/2 inch wood here for, I don't want a punk light piece, but I want a piece that's definitely perfectly straight. Now the 2 mistakes you can make with this, number 1 is to put the grain in front to back. You want the grain end to end. Fill in between the mounts. And you'll look at almost every plane that classic plane or planes that have tended to be real successful, almost every one of them has 1/2 inch wood, medium grain, so I'm going to weigh all these. I only have about 15 of them. But I want about a mid-range one. I don't want a punk part. I don't want a 12-pound piece. I'd like something, I'll take one that's right in the middle. Probably that'll be about a 60 grain piece, a 1/2 inch. Well, most of these are on the light side, so I sure as hell don't want to use a real light one. And I need enough to do 2 crutches here. They're all coming in the mid-60s. So, main thing is that it's a perfectly straight piece of wood. I don't want to build a crutch and it turns into a pretzel a week later. The way of getting these measured is I have a little machinist ruler and I use my thumb as the guide. My thumb is keeping it from going any further over. So I set it up and I'm at 2.2 and I want to walk down the whole length without putting any pressure on it and see if I'm 2.2. Let me bring this into camera range. Now it just happens that I am, but I want to check it at every station that I'm 2.2 using my thumb as the gauge. Now I can take one of these pieces of prime wood, and by the way, out of that whole pile there was only 2 pieces that were worth having. So George is going to have a lot of RC wood coming up real soon. Now there's a lot of ways to do this. If you take a pen and scribe it, then you need to leave the whole pen line on. A better way is take a brand new blade, get this as close to the corner as you possibly can. Again, it's a little tricky to do on camera, and run a knife line. Now when I go to the jigsaw, I want to make sure I leave that knife line on because I want a nice press fit. This is the hard part. And notice the grain is going side to side. A lot of people put the grain in this way. Not quite as good because anybody can tell you, squeeze the wood this way, it's real easy to squeeze. Try squeezing it end grain, almost impossible. We want to leave that line on. Now by using that method, sometimes you just need a couple of swipes with a sanding block, but you'd like to get a relatively nice tight fit. I'd almost like it to stay there without me pulling it apart. Right, I'm just going to replicate the same thing, and to do that I'm going to just keep using the mount. I'm not going to try to trace this piece of wood because each one will just get bigger and bigger and bigger. I'll use the original part, and usually I need 3 for each crutch, so I'll make 6 of them. But I'm only going to need 2 pieces because I want the bulkhead that's going to come up through here to go right through and touch the mounts, of course. So I'm going to lay this out real carefully over the planes. I think I can do this with 2 pieces. I want to mix up some slow drying epoxy and make sure I have the same dimension for the whole length. I don't want to build a bow into it or anything. And by using a real accurate pattern, you don't even get a joint in here that's unacceptable. A lot of fine tuning with the sanding block. I want these parts to go in exactly this way. I've just dressed each edge off just enough so that's a nice press fit. I can mix up some slow drying epoxy here and get this right in. The part that really is a good trick. Now I've mixed up the epoxy. Even though I have about 15 minutes working time here, I like to get moving on this. Now, first thing, you got to saturate the end grain of these pieces of wood. I have my own little way of doing this. And when you're making a crutch, no matter if you're making it for a Thunderbird or a Nobler, an SV11, it doesn't matter. That wood between the mounts, in fact, the person that taught me how important it was Jim Greenaway. Many times we'd take a model that was already built that motor wouldn't run right, cut the top block off, glue wood between the mounts, motor ran perfect. By the way, one of the people that's really super aware of how important that was the late Bob Barron. Now, the little trick that's worth it, put the gun on a low setting, warm the epoxy so it sinks into that end grain. This is the whole deal. Now you know it's going to get messy, so we have our jar of alcohol handy. As soon as you see bubbles, that's the point at which you can't go any further. You're not improving the flow of the epoxy after you see bubbles. So I'm getting my parts all staged up here. But the heat and the end grain will make this a furniture joint that you'll almost never break. And it almost guarantees a really reliable motor run. And that's the whole purpose of having a crutch to begin with. Now, since we know how we want these parts to go in, I've already got them kind of figured out here. Again, I want to do a little squeezing and moving around. I can get as much epoxy in there as I want right now. It won't really matter. Anything that oozes out, we'll take care of with the alcohol. But we want a good solid, I call it a furniture joint, a joint that's not going to let go in service. I have the little dots so I know exactly how this is going to go in. It's a press fit. It's not even a press fit. Now some of that is obviously going to ooze out when we squeeze it. And that's what we want to happen. Now at this point in time, you have a lot of choices. One of the best is you can just take some rubber bands and wrap it around this, and I've done that. Second choice is grab a piece of this old tape. It's way too sticky. Always leave the motor mounts a little bit oversized so you have a place to grab it. And I'll just hold it in position while you can do the rest of this. I want to even that out. And while it's sitting here, I want to take some alcohol. Again, if you're working with a friend, this can be a good time to have a friend. And it's a good thing if you're working with somebody and he's going to build a plane too. Build two crutches. I'm going to build two of these. The second one I'll make off camera because they're pretty much redundant. Except the one that's going to go in a wood fuselage and we're going to use has the hollowed out mounts. The other one, since we're only going to use it for a plug, it won't really matter. Now, a little Home Depot furniture clamp. It has two pins. You can lay it right on the pins in the center of the wood. Keep in mind what we're doing. We're using the motor itself as a fixture. And as you squeeze it, guess what? Even more epoxy comes out. I would not want to put it in a real vise like a tool vise because you might put so much pressure on it you'd crush or bend the mounts. You just want a nice even pressure. Now, when I went to Home Depot, these were about 10 bucks, 12 bucks. It's a good idea to even have two of them because then you can space them out. But I think even just with this, the simplest of things, and I'm a big believer in it, doesn't have to be real complicated. And we'll just put that aside to dry. And you notice there's almost no epoxy mess. When we're done with this, it'll be a 2-minute job. I'm going to go have lunch and a cup of coffee while this is going on. There's almost no way this can come out crooked now. If it were to, for instance, if you built a twist into it and you weren't happy with it, make another one. From time to time you build one and you'll put a stress in it, but a pre-stressed, this is being used as the fixture. So what it means is when you go to put the motor back in, it'll drop right in. And it's nothing more frustrating. You build a whole plane, you put the motor in, you tighten the bolts, and it goes and the fuselage bends and the paint cracks. This is the best way I know of to do it. Now it's a question of taking the engine out, dressing all these edges off. I think we'll trim the bolts at this point in time too, so we don't have to screw those bolts all the way back in and out, but that's basically it. We just need to put the tank shim on here. Now there's always 1/8 of an inch minimum of tank shim, so I don't see any reason not to just glue it right to the crutch. If you've ever left the bolts too long and had them come up through the top block, you'll know what this is all about. one last thing here to check out is with pressure on it. Because I can always true it up if I ground it off on one side more than the other. That's pretty good. And of course the final test is see if you can find somebody to answer the phone. So I want to remove the wood ahead of time. It'll just be easier. I got to put the tank shim in yet. Let me line this right up on the fuselage side. And you can see where I have the estimate here. I want to just grind and cut enough away that this will extend out almost to the high point of the wing. But I certainly don't want to do this after I build a crutch and then have to get in here. This has almost a perfect airfoil. It turned out that way. Now the last little thing I need to do on this, I want to go down here and I want to put an 1/8 inch shim right over the bottom, relatively hard wood, and then a piece of 64th plywood on top of that, and that'll complete the crutch. Now we know, for example, with the jet, we know it's going to shim up off here between 1/8 of and maybe even more, maybe 3/16. I'm not sure. Each one seems to be a little different. But we know that first shim, if we just slide in a piece of balsa wood, well, it rides around and stuff. But if we glue it to this, it'll just tend to reinforce the crutch. And if you know ahead of time that you're going to need a certain shim, 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch, or whatever, there's no point not gluing it right on here. And I always like to have the tank floor to be a 64th plywood so the tank doesn't start embedding its way in there. And when we bring the shim all the way to the back, we're going to go right around here so that this will be a real close fit to the wing. And this will act as a former back here. Trying to make everything does some work. There's nothing just going along for the ride. As I'm making these crutches, and I just thought I'd mention this, I just thinking of an idea that now, while I'm done with that, of laying a part like this up and molding it and making a whole thing out of carbon fiber, and then I could put some reinforcements in here or whatever. This will be an interesting thing I'll be thinking about in the next week or so. I don't need to make it today. And the one I'm going to make off camera, the one I'm going to make for the plug, I just need to put any piece of wood in there. It won't matter, since we're not going to even run a motor in that. It's just to set it up to act like a little fixture. But boy, if there's a better way to make a nose section of a plane, this is the best way I know of, no matter what design you're making. Nice, real convenient way of putting in a tank shim like this. Just leave the parts oversized. Just take them over to the belt sander and grind them flat when we're all done. What happens if you try to cut it real even, you can see you get a kind of a ratty edge, and just isn't as nice as when you just run it on a belt sander. Just put them in, leave them a little oversized. Now I'm just going to lay in a little piece here that's just going to be the butt joint part. But this will act as a little bit of a former. Because remember, where this fuselage is the weakest is right above the wing. So we're trying to make that part of it as strong as possible. Now this piece here, you just run on that belt sander on that wheel. Boy, that just makes doing that job. If you'd had to do that with a Dremel tool or by hand, that'd be a lot of work. Now we can hopefully get a piece of this to sit right in there, nice and flat. Now the thing that I wanted to, another good tip, before you run this on a belt sander, it's always a good idea to seal this edge with thin CA. Because when we belt sand that, that's going to be a joint that actually touches the plywood doubler. And this piece here we can just get rid of for now. Then I would just take a trip to the belt sander and that'll all be trued up. It'll be very nice. Very easy, very nice. Want to bring the tank shim back to this spot. This is the spot where we're going to have to, in theory anyway, we're going to have to put a notch here for the bulkhead, so I don't want to make this go any further back than I have to. And I want this to be 64th plywood. This will give me a nice edge with the grain again going side to side. I can just leave it hanging out just a little bit. And then the nice part about that is I can take it over to the old belt sander and finish it off. And I need to get a little more than that, a little hanging out. Anyway, we're closing in on having this tape done, and we're also closing in on having a crutch done. This crutch went very well. And I hope you can use this technology. I hope you can use this. You can use it on any plane, even your own design. Now, the whole motive between all of this is not to let anything go along for the ride. Everything should be working hard. Or doing some work anyway. Something like work. Just let this hang out just a tad. Of course, the bulkhead's going to come in here and we want to interlock that. I want to make a tongue and groove when I figure out what that former is going to look like. Pretty well laid out the tank box, so I would guess for an afternoon of work that's a pretty nice piece of work. There's nothing going on. It's just going for the ride. But if you leave out these aluminum pads, leave out the wood, yeah, every once in a while you'll get a motor run. But this guarantees this whole unit, and I want to really thank Big Jim Greenaway for years ago convincing me of how important it was to do this. We've had these on the Spitfires and Seafires. They're light. This is as rigid as can be. And now with the shoulder bolts, I hope this is all going to relate into being something that's even a little bit lighter, a little bit more rigid. And then we'll be able to make, hopefully going to be able to make some kind of a molded part. Anyway, I'm thinking about that more and more already. The idea of all this is that just about nothing goes along for the ride. And we have some of our tank shims already in place, absorbing vibration and making the nose more rigid. Final thing, all this end grain I want to seal. Now that I have the shape I want, it'll seal the edge of the plywood, and then I'll dress this edge off again. You can see how that end grain soaks it up. This is the one part of the plane that's really going to do a lot of work. Anytime you do, I mean, it's old technology, even going way back. Anytime you have end grain wood, double glue it. See, it's all these little details. Every time you can make one part a little bit stronger, you in essence can make the plane a little bit stronger, a little bit lighter. Look at that, I glued it right to the table. And you think I'm going to go back and take that off, reverse the camera? Nah. Nah, the truth is, there's a lot of little errors in everything. But that gives a nice solid part to lay the tank on. It's also going to allow us that extra little bit to cock the tank out. That's what I'm really looking to do. Boy, that was such a good trick. I can't tell you. It made us crazy. Tom Hampshire passed that on to me. And we couldn't get the motor to shut and just cock the tank out just like that. It shut off every time at the team trials even. All right, next step, I'm going to do the other crutch off camera. The other crutch doesn't need a tank shim. It just needs to be accurate so I can make the plug, and I'll do that whole operation off camera. Now the crutch that we're going to use for the plug, I just clipped it off at the wing because the formers aren't going to matter at that point, and I'm only really concerned that they're exactly the same width. I don't want to have one a lot wider or smaller because a lot of these parts I'd like to have interchangeable if possible. Thinking about that carbon crutch now. Well, like I always say, at some point in time it's starting to become an airplane. We're at the end of this tape. On the next tape we're going to lay out the formers, hopefully carve some blocks. Now this would have gone a lot faster had we not been making this plug for the carbon fuselage, but again, that's the fun of modeling, is you can do what you want. You're not restricted by any bounds. And I hope you've gotten some good information off the tape, things that you can put right in the bank. Things you can put on a plane you're building right now, like that tank trick and that crutch. Even if you only pick up off of a whole set of videos, one or two good ideas. That crutch is one, and boy, when Jim Greenaway turned me on to that, and I saw Bob Barron had it in all of his planes, I learned later Paul Walker has it in all of his planes, Kaz Minato. But there was a point in time when I didn't know. And I'm just laying this all out for a proportion look. See, this is Gerald Schamp's fuselage. Let me kick this into position. The wing and tail relationship is real close, except this is not going to be a low-wing plane. But it doesn't mean it won't evolve into one in the next model. We might go for dihedral, lower in the wing. Make it a little bit more like Gerald Schamp's fuse, and boy, this is a work of art. Everybody that's looked at this just flips out when they see how nice it is. See, and actually this type of a fuselage would make a better molded fuselage because it has this strong part right over the wing. This might get a little flimsy there, but we're certainly going to find out as we evolve this. Anyway, it's evolving. Hope you've enjoyed the video, and hope you've, like I said many times, picked up some good ideas. The wheel pants are coming out of the mold. Hey. And it's Christmas. We're almost ready to decorate the house this weekend. And this is what's funny here is people walk by, they don't realize the epoxy's wet, and everybody's tempted to just put their finger in it. Yeah. Anyway, it's coming along, and I am inspired. I'm really looking forward to doing this. Looking forward to decorating the house for Christmas. And special thanks to Elliot for all his help. He has really been a big help with the plans. The plans are coming, guys. I know a lot of people are already interested in buying a set. He's working on them as we make this video. This is his little Cardinal, by the way. Plans are available to this little version of the Cardinal. And we hope it won't be long before we have some real quality plans for Miss Ashley. To close out the video with some footage from Al Rabe of his Bearcat, which is almost finished. Al has allowed me to steal little bits and pieces of this. We'll put a little bit on some of the tapes. We're at the end, and we're going to come to whatever logical conclusion. It'll probably end right in the middle of Al saying something important, but we got about 5 minutes left on a tape, 3 minutes, and I hate to run them right to the very end, because what happens, and not all these tapes are exactly the same length, and you'd be in the middle of doing something important. Anyway, thanks again to Al Rabe for sharing this stuff with us. And I'll marry that footage up right on the end. This is from Al Rabe and it's current footage. And yeah, I just can't tell you how happy I am to have Al back building and cajoling and doing all the things that, I guess, you know, the big part of this is when you make something beautiful like these airplanes, you need somebody to hang out with and, you know, do your thing with. Not having a friend to build a Mustang with, it's tough. Anyway, he's got some footage of his Bearcat and it's really cool looking. And if you look at some of the footage, well, I can't put the whole thing, but some of the footage of his shop, he's got the things hanging from the ceiling and things that really are interesting. Now, I just heard recently that Paul Winter has decided to build a Tsunami right to print without deviation, so we're going to be monitoring him. Ken Clapson's got his already almost ready, and hey, let's see what's new in the world of Al Rabe here. And then we definitely, at the end of this tape, we will see you on the next tape. And thanks to Al for sharing the footage with us.
We're just now about to finish up the fuselage. I finally molded the bottom cowl and cut it to its pretty much final shape. And from here, now that the bottom cowl is shaped properly, my next step is for a fiberglass cowling. Anyway, things are coming along. I shallowed the gear doors a little bit, scared them up a little bit, made them for 2 3/4 inch wheels instead of 3-inch wheels. It makes them a little more realistic. Actually, it would be a better Bearcat 3 perhaps if I would quit screwing with it. But seems hardly worth the effort to build an airplane the way I built it 30 years ago. Certainly have to admit there's deja vu. It really feels odd building the same airplane again after 30 years. Anyway, I have made changes. Moved the gear apart, moved the gear out one bay, and I think that alone is going to make for a much nicer looking airplane. Days later, got the wing sheeted. I got the tail surfaces all made, and they're all cut and fit and tried. Still got to put the push rod in though, the elevator push rod. When that's finished, all the tail end will get glued together. The wing will get glued on. Then the jig tubes will come out, and the belly will be installed, and the wingtips carved and assembled. Then we're really hurting for a canopy. But it's coming along. It was a really good move. Really helped the looks of the airplane a lot. To have the gear out a bit further. Did a little work on the tail today. Cut me a nifty little fairing out of 16th sheet balsa. And when it's finally installed, it'll certainly make the tail all come together, flow together in a very smooth and fluid fashion. And I'm heading for a canopy now. Not so much, though. I was checking around last night. Coincidentally, the P-47 canopy that I molded for Jim Lynch. It's a beautiful mold. And coincidentally, it has exactly the same side view as the Bearcat, and it is coincidental. I had no idea when I was building it that it would do that, but nevertheless, airplanes are really progressing. I made a couple of dumb mistakes. I had the top of the wing inletted to take so that the gas tank could have some travel up and down. And then I mounted the gas tank where it would only go in, straight out. So I had to cut back into the airplane and remove the bottom half of the leading edge so that the tank could come straight down through it. Either that or gut the tank and figure out a new way of putting it in. I just gutted the wing. Everything will be okay. It doesn't show. It is kind of fun. The airplane's got some really gorgeous lines toward the tail end, which makes the airplane a real pleasure to shape. When the lines really flow, and by the time we get paint on it, it'll be very noticeable. Coming out now. That's always a big deal for me to get the jig tubes out of the airplane. First of all, in a few minutes we're going to find out what it weighs. Heat weighs with the engine, tank, prop, and spinner. I think it's going to weigh about 43 ounces. I hope I'm... Anyway, the engine, prop, spinner, tank, what have you. So, a few final views of the airplane. These final views as far as this day is concerned. Well, naturally, I'm a little unhappy about the idea of 48 ounces before beginning to finish. But considering I'll put a PA-60 in this, I'm very apprehensive about structure. And there's a lot more structure in the wing center section. And hold downs, glue, epoxy, carbon toes, the wing trailing edge, wing leading edge, stab leading and trailing edge, everything. Airplane. I could have saved about 3 ounces, but anyway, not 2 ounces anyhow. But still, maybe the weight, maybe it'll be worth it weight-wise. Well, everybody's got their own way of doing wingtips. Tonight, I'm doing wingtips in the Bearcat. I started with wingtips made out of 2 pieces of 3/4 balsa, which are sawed to shape, tack glued onto the wingtip, and I'm going to shape those to a rough outline with a moto tool and a little sanding drum. They cut surprisingly well. Then I'll take the sanding block and I'll sand it until the top and bottom surfaces are, and then finally I carve the roundness into the tip. Anyway, let's go on and do a little carving.